The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 6. An Appeal for Help. For one of the very few times in her life when confronted by an emergency, the little captain did not know quite what to do. Grace clung to Betty, murmuring over and over again, "What shall I say? What shall I do?" Amy and Molly stared uncomprehendingly at one another. Grace still held the telegram that had brought more bad news. Then Betty got her senses in working order. "In the first place," she said, "you mustn't let your mother know about this, Grace. You must keep it from her. In the second place, your father must be told at once. Now you go in and act as if nothing had happened. I'll go see your father." "But I can't act as if nothing had happened," protested Grace, with a wailing tone in her voice. "I'd be sure to act so strangely that Mamma would suspect at once and begin to question me." "Then Molly or Amy must go in with you and help to keep up appearances. Amy, you go in and talk, play, sing, dance, do anything to keep Grace from feeling bad and giving away the secret. As soon as Mr. Ford comes, he can decide whether or not to tell his wife. Molly, you and I will go down to his office. This is the night he gets home late, isn't it, Grace?" Yes. Oh, how I wish he were here now, poor Will." "Well, we'll soon have him home," declared Betty. "Now you two do as I tell you. Talk about Florida, anything but what has happened. Mr. Ford will know what to do when he comes. Now, Molly, let's hurry." "Gracious, I believe it's going to snow." "Well, we won't have any of that in Florida. That's a blessing for you, Grace," and Betty smiled bravely. "We may never go now if Will isn't found." "Oh, he'll be all right," declared Betty, with more confidence than she felt. "Come along, Molly." The two set off through the gathering storm, while Grace and Amy turned into the former's house. They were under a strain, and afterward they hardly remembered what they did, but Grace did not betray the secret at any rate. The two girls talked of many things, and when Mrs. Ford referred to the homecoming of her son, Amy changed the subject as soon as she could. Then, fortunately, Mrs. Ford went upstairs to lie down until dinner was ready, and Grace, with a sigh of relief, threw herself on a couch. "There," she sighed, "we can act naturally now. Poor little mother! I wonder how she will take it." "Oh, she is brave," said Amy. "Besides, nothing very dreadful can have happened. Will might be all right. Even if he has gone off with a labor contractor who has a bad reputation, your brother is able to look after himself. He can appeal to the police if necessary." "Perhaps. Anyhow, you can look on the bright side, Amy. I wish Papa would hurry." "Oh, he will as soon as Betty tells him." Meanwhile, Betty and Molly were hurrying on through the storm to Mr. Ford's office. They found him working over a complicated law case, and he seemed startled when he saw the two girls. "Where is Grace? What has happened?" he asked quickly. "This telegram. It came for you to the house. Grace opened it," explained Molly briefly. Mr. Ford seemed to comprehend it at a glance. "I was afraid of this," he exclaimed. "Some of those rascally labor contractors will do anything to get help. I will have to go down there, I think. Does Mrs. Ford know?" "No. I told Grace to keep it from her until you came home." "That was right. I must make light of this. Then I'll leave for Jacksonville at once. Thank you very much, Betty." He closed his desk and went out with the girls, calling a carriage for them and himself, as the snow was now falling heavily. In some way Mr. Ford managed to impart some of the details of the new emergency to his wife without unduly arousing her. He also spoke of the necessity of going to Florida. "Oh, do you really have to go?" his wife asked in alarm. "I think it will be better. Will may do something rash, thinking he is putting through a fine business deal. I don't want him to get into legal difficulties. It would not look well for my professional reputation," and Mr. Ford forced a laugh to reassure his wife. Arrangements for going to Jacksonville were soon made, as he was to leave on the midnight train. In the meanwhile, he communicated with the telegraph authorities in the South, telling them of his plans and asking for any additional information. All that he could learn was that Will had gone to the address given in his first letter, a private boarding-house. He had been there a few days making friends with the landlady, and finally had gone off with a man who bore a shady reputation in the city. Will had said he was going farther into the interior, and the woman thought she heard something about a lumber camp, or a place where turpentine and other pine tar products were obtained. "Well, do the best you can, Grace, until I come back," said Mr. Ford, "and look after your mother. Perhaps this will be all right after all." There were 3 weary days of waiting, relieved only by brief messages from Mr. Ford saying that he was doing all he could to find Will. Mrs. Ford was not told the whole story, save that her son had gone into the interior. "Oh, I'm sure something must have happened," exclaimed Grace, when on the 4th day there came a message saying Mr. Ford was on his way back. "He hasn't Will with him, or he would have said so. Oh, isn't it perfectly terrible?" "Now, don't worry," advised Betty. "I know that is easy to say, Grace, and hard to do, but try. Even if your father hasn't found Will, perhaps he has some trace of him. He would hardly come back without good reason." "I suppose not. Oh, aren't boys terrible?" "But Will didn't mean to cause all this trouble," spoke Molly. "I know, but he has, just the same." Grace was too miserable even to think of chocolates. Mr. Ford looked pale and tired when he came home, and his eyes showed loss of sleep. "Well," he said to Grace, who was surrounded by her 3 chums, "I didn't find Will. He seems to have made a mess of it." "How?" asked his sister. "Well, by getting in with this developing concern. It seems that he signed some sort of contract agreeing to work for them. He supposed it was clerical or secretary's work, but it turns out that he was deceived. What he signed was a contract to work in one of the many camps in the wilds of the interior. He may be getting out cypress or turpentine." "Couldn't you locate him, Daddy?" asked Grace. "No, the firm he signed with operates many camps. I could get very little satisfaction from them. I may have to appeal to the authorities." "But Will is not of age. They can't hold him even if he did sign a contract to work, especially when they deceived him," declared Grace. "I know it, my dear," replied her father, "but they have him in their clutches, and possession, as you know, is 9 points of the law and part of the 10th. Where Will is, I don't know. Just as the message said, he went off with that smooth talker, and he seems to have disappeared." "How can you find him?" asked Grace. "I'm going to have your Uncle Isaac trace him. He knows the South better than I, and can work to better advantage. That is why I came back. Uncle Isaac is in New York City now. I am going to telegraph him to come on here, and I'll give him the particulars. Then he can hunt for Will. Poor boy! I guess he wishes now that he'd stayed in the mill." The news was broken to Mrs. Ford as gently as could be, but it nearly prostrated her. Then Uncle Isaac came, and to his credit be it said that he was kinder than his wont. He seemed really sympathetic, and did not once say "I told you so." He readily agreed to search for his nephew, and left for the South as soon as he could finish his business. "I guess our Florida trip is all off," said Grace with a sigh one evening. "Not at all," said her father. "I want you girls to go. It may be that you might hear some word of Will." "Then we will go," his sister cried. "Oh, I do hope we can find him." The preparations for the Florida trip went on. Meanwhile nothing was heard from the missing youth, and Uncle Isaac had no success. Then, most expectedly, there came word from the boy himself, indirect word, but news just the same. It was in the shape of a letter from a Southern planter, who said one of his hands had picked up the enclosed note in a cotton field near a railroad track. It had probably been tossed from a train window, and had laid some time in the field, being rain-soaked. It bore Mr. Ford's address, and so the planter forwarded it. The note was as follows: "Dear Dad, I certainly am in trouble. That development business was a fake, and I have literally been kidnapped, with a lot of other young fellows, some colored. They're taking us away to a turpentine swamp to work. I've tried to escape, but it's no use. I appealed for help to the crowd, as did some of the others, but the contractors declared we were a lot of criminals farmed out by the state, and as a lot of their workers really are convicts, I had no show. I don't know what to do. Help me if you can. I don't know where they're taking us, but if I get a chance, I'll send word. I'm scribbling this under my hat in the train, and I'm going to toss it out the window. I hope you get it. Will. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 7. Off for Florida. Grace was in tears when her father finished reading Will's pathetic letter, nor were the eyes of her chums altogether dry, for they all liked Will, who seemed as much a brother to them as he did to his own sister. We mustn't let Mama know this," announced Grace, when she had regained control of herself. "It would prostrate her." "Yes, we must keep it from her if we can," agreed Mr. Ford. "To think of poor Will being in with criminals," went on his sister. "It will be a terrible experience for him." "Perhaps they are not desperate criminals," suggested Amy, as a sort of ray of hope. "No, I do not believe they are," said Mr. Ford frankly. "The state would not let contractors hire them if they were. I suppose they are mostly young men who have been guilty of slight violations of the law, and hard work is the best punishment for them. But I certainly am sorry for Will. I had no idea that when to punish him for what was more thoughtlessness than anything else, I sent him south, it would turn out this way. I regret it very much." "But it wasn't your fault, Daddy," declared Grace. "It just couldn't be helped. But Will is brave. His letter shows that. Oh, can you help him?" "I certainly shall, daughter," and Mr. Ford put his hand on Grace's head, now bowed in grief. "I will write to Uncle Isaac at once, and have him get in touch with the authorities. They should be able to tell where the different gangs of prisoners have been sent, and by investigating each one we can, by elimination, find Will. Then it will be an easy matter to get him home, and I think he will be very glad to see Deepdale again, in spite of the fact that he wanted to start out for himself to make good. I hope the lesson will not be too hard for him." "If we could only do something!" exclaimed Betty. "Yes, girls always seem so helpless at a time like this," murmured Molly. "Oh, I wish I were a man." "Tut, tut!" exclaimed Mr. Ford with a laugh, something he had seldom indulged in of late. "We couldn't get along without our girls. You can offer sympathy if nothing else, and often that is something as real as actual service. But I don't agree that you girls are helpless. You have proved in the past that you outdoor lassies can do things, and I would not be surprised in the future if you gave further evidence of it." Though he spoke rather lightly, Mr. Ford little realized how soon the time was to come when the outdoor girls were to prove their sterling worth in a peculiar manner. "Well, things are certainly taking a queer turn," said Grace, as she looked at the scribbled letter of her brother, so strangely forwarded to them. "There is no telling how long ago this was written. Poor Will is probably having a hard time this very minute." "He probably is, if he's at work in a turpentine camp," said Mr. Ford. "It is no easy work, and it is no wonder the contractors have to take criminals and fairly kidnap their helpers. Then they have to literally mount guard over them to force them to remain. But I must start things moving to aid Will." Letters were written to Uncle Isaac, to the planter who had so kindly forwarded the letter, and to various authorities. "But you girls must not let this interfere with your trip, nor with the enjoyment of it," said Mr. Ford, who had told his wife something of the truth, but not enough to cause her to worry. He said they had word from Will, and hoped soon to have him home. And Mrs. Ford, who leaned much on her husband and daughter, was more content than she had been. "Get ready, Grace," said her father, "and enjoy your winter in the South." "I certainly don't enjoy a winter in the North," she replied. "Girls, did you see my chocolates?" "Hopeless, hopeless," murmured Molly with a smile as she found the confections on the mantel. Preparations for the Florida trip went on apace. The girls were so busy sorting out what clothes they were going to take and having new gowns made that for a time they almost forgot about Will. Though Mr. Ford had set in motion various forces, no definite word had yet been received, but they were hoping that every day would bring some message. Uncle Isaac wrote that he was doing all he could. Frank Haley, Will's school chum, and Allen Washburn, the young lawyer, were very anxious to start off and make a search for their friend, but Mr. Ford, though deeply grateful to them, thought it might complicate matters. So, much against their desire, the two young men were forced to remain in Deepdale. "Though we may take a run down and see you," said Allen to Betty a few days before the one set for the departure, "would you mind?" "We shall be very glad to see you," she answered, rather non-committally. "We?" he asked pointedly. "Oh, of course I meant that I would too," and she blushed as she glanced at him. "That's better," he laughed. The next day Molly telephoned for all of her chums to gather at her house for a sort of farewell tea some of the friends of the girls wished to tender to them. It was a cold, snowy, blustery day, and as Grace, wrapped in her furs, walked shiveringly along with Amy and Betty, she remarked, "I can almost envy Will now, down where it is nice and warm." "Oh, we'll soon be there," answered Betty. They found Molly in the midst of showing some of her new gowns to her friends, and the three chums joined in the admiration. For Molly, with the characteristics of a French girl, loved pretty clothes, and rather inclined to a pronounced style not indulged in by her chums, but she always dressed becomingly. "It is lovely!" exclaimed Hattie Reynolds. "But isn't it awfully light, Molly?" "Not for where we are going," was the answer. "You forget that we are going to a summer land. Oh, Dodo, stop that!" she cried, for from the room where stood Molly's half-packed trunk came the twin, trailing a garment. "That's my best petticoat," wailed Molly. "You'll ruin it. And, Paul, what are you doing with that shirt-waist? It's my very finest lawn." "Us looking for Tandy," calmly announced Dodo. "As oot got any in oo pockets?" "Pockets? We never have pockets!" cried Betty. "Oh, aren't they too funny for anything?" "You wouldn't say so if they did this or something like it to you 3 or 4 times a day," exclaimed Molly, half crossly, as she advanced to rescue her garments. But the twins backed away, stepping on the skirt. "Paul, Dodo, give those to sister at once," commanded Molly. "Us will for Tandy," stipulated Paul craftily. "Oh, if I only had some!" exclaimed Molly. "Allow me," volunteered Grace, producing a bag. "Here, children." "Not while they have my things!" cried Molly. "Chocolate on my white waist! Never! Put the things down, Paul, Dodo, and Grace will give you candy." "Oo dot Tandy?" asked Dodo, looking doubtfully at Grace. "Yes," and she opened the bag to show them. This was evidence enough, and the garments were placed where they belonged, Molly hastening in to lay them straight again. The little tea was a success, in spite of the invasion of the twins. The girls were bidden farewell by their friends, rather envious friends, to be frank, for who would not envy one a trip to sunny Florida with its flowers in the midst of winter? The motorboat had been crated and shipped. Mr. Stonington had arranged his business for a long stay in the South, and all was in readiness for the trip. The girls had decided on 101 things to take with them, and had rejected as many, only to make new selections. But finally even their exacting tastes were gratified and satisfied, and their trunks were ready to go. "But oh, I do wish Aunty Stonington was better," sighed Amy, the day before that set for their departure. "Why, is she worse?" asked Betty. "She seems very weak. Uncle is quite worried about her, though the doctor says the change will benefit her as soon as we get there. But I am afraid about the trip, though we are to go in a compartment car and won't have to change." "That will be lovely," said Grace. "We'll look after your aunt for you, Amy." "That's sweet of you girls. Perhaps it will not be as bad as I fear. But she seems failing rapidly. The winter has been unusually severe for her." "And poor mamma is not herself," murmured Grace. "Lack of news from Will seems to prey on her mind. But there, don't let's talk any more about our troubles. Let's look on the bright side of the clouds. I'm sure we ought to just hug Amy to pieces for giving us this nice trip." "Well, please leave enough pieces of me so I can eat an orange or two when we get to Florida," laughed Amy. "Also enough to catch a few alligators," added Betty. "Don't you mention the horrid things!" cried Grace, with a nervous shiver. "Are there really any there, Amy? Say no, my dear, and I'll give you 2 chocolates." "Well, there are some," said Amy, who never could seem to dissimulate. "But Uncle Stonington says they are small, at least, near where we are going. Some people have them for pets." "Mercy!" cried Grace. "I'd as soon have a pet snake." "Well, we won't worry about them until we get bitten," suggested Molly, "and perhaps their bark is worse than their bite. Do they bark, Amy?" "I'm sure I don't know." "No, they cry like babies," said Grace. "Don't you remember alligator tears?" "She's thinking of crocodiles," said Betty, "or else alligator pears." "Worse and worse," protested Molly. "We'll have the fauna and flora of Florida hopelessly mixed before we get through. Now let's see if we have everything packed." And they went over their list of belongings for the 10th time. But all things must have an end, and so did their preparations. The day of the start came, final good-byes were said, and with Mr. and Mrs. Stonington, the 4 outdoor girls took the train for the sunny South. The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 8. Launching the Boat. "Can you smell the orange blossoms?" "Yes, aren't they delicious?" "It reminds me of a wedding. Hark! Can you hear the strains of Mendelssohn?" "Those are frogs, Betty," laughed Molly. The girls and Mr. and Mrs. Stonington were driving in a big canopy-topped carriage along a Florida road toward the orange grove on the outskirts of the town of Bentonville. Their journey was over, and at last they were in Florida. "Oh, see the magnolias!" cried Grace as they passed a tree in full bloom, the fragrance being almost overpowering. "They are just like those the boys sold us when the train stopped." "Only they smell much sweeter," said Betty. "Yes, almost too sweet," added Molly. Their trip had been practically without incident, and certainly without accident. There had been 1 or 2 delays, caused by various small happenings, but finally they had steamed into the Junction station, where they took a way train for Bentonville. This last was a short trip, the one in the compartment car without change having been rather monotonous, and yet not dull, for the girls found much to talk about, to speculate upon, and to wonder at. The snow, the cold and biting winds had gradually been left behind, and nature, coy and uncertain at first, had, with the advance into the south, grown bolder. They had come from the land of bleakness and barrenness, from the place of leafless trees, into the region of summer almost in a day and night. They had exchanged snows for flowers. Mrs. Stonington had stood the trip well, though a trifle weary and worn as the end of the journey came in sight. But the warm and balmy air of the South seemed to revive her, and her cheeks, that had been pale, took on a tinge of color. "Oh, I am so glad," murmured Amy, and the others were glad with her. They had delayed at the Bentonville station long enough to make sure that Betty's boat had arrived, and to send home telegrams telling of their safe journey. They had been met by a man from the orange grove, a kindly Southern worker whose very nature seemed to protest against haste and worry. "Well," he greeted them slowly, "I see you all has arrived. Welcome, folks. Now, when you're ready, we'll move along, but don't be in no rush. It's too powerful warm to rush." Indeed, it was warm, and the girls, who had changed to some of their summer garments, felt the truth of this. "Oh, for a lawn waist and a white skirt, low canvas shoes, and a palm leaf fan," sighed Molly, as they drove beneath great trees that tempered the heat of the sun. "Anything else?" asked Betty with a laugh. "Lemonade," suggested Amy. "Or, no, since we are on an orange plantation, I suppose orangeade would be more appropriate, girls." "Anything as long as it's cool," sighed Grace. "I declare, all my chocolates have run together." And she looked with dismay into a box of the confection she had been carrying. "No wonder, it's summer, and we left winter behind us," said Betty. "You'll have to give up chocolates down here, Grace, my dear." "Or else keep them on ice," ventured Amy. A turn of the road brought them in full view of the orange grove in which Mr. Stonington was interested, and at the sight a murmur of pleased surprise broke from the girls. "And to think of going out there and picking oranges as one would apples!" exclaimed Amy. "Doesn't it seem odd to see oranges that aren't in a crate or a fruit store?" "Some of those will be in crates 'fore night," said the driver. "We're picking every day now. It's a good season, and we're making the most of it," he added to Mr. Stonington. "Glad to hear it. You'll have to ship them as fast as you can with 4 orange-hungry girls on hand," and he laughed at Amy and her chums. "Oh, Uncle Stonington!" Amy cried, "as if we could eat all the oranges here!" and she looked over the rows and rows of fruit-laden trees. "You ain't no idea how many oranges you can eat when y'all get them right off a tree," said the driver. "They taste different from the ones you Northerners have, I tell you." One of the foremen, whom Mr. Stonington had met before, came from the grove to welcome them, and to show them the way to the bungalow they were to occupy during their stay in the South. "We hope you like it here," said the overseer, a Mr. Hammond. "I don't see how we could help it," said Mrs. Stonington. "I am in love with the place already, and I feel so much better, even with this little taste of summer." "That's good," exclaimed her husband with shining eyes. As the carriage stopped in front of a cool-looking bungalow, a comfortable-looking colored mammy came to the door smiling expansively. "Bress all yo' hearts!" she exclaimed. "Climb right down and come in ya. I's got de fried chicken and corn pone all ready for y'all. And dere's soft crabs for dem as wants 'em, and chicken gumbo soup, and—" "Hold on, Aunt Hannah!" exclaimed Mr. Hammond with a laugh. "Have a little mercy on them. Maybe they are not hungry for all your good things." "Oh, aren't we, though?" cried Molly. "Just try me. I've always wanted chicken fried in the Southern style." "You'll get it here," said Mr. Stonington. Let us pass over that first meal, something that the girls did not do by any means, but the mere details of our friends arriving, getting settled, and then of resting to enjoy life as they had never enjoyed it before, can have little of interest to the reader. So, as I said, let us pass over a few days. Each one, it is true, brought something new and of peculiar interest to the girls, but it was only because they had never before been in Florida. To the residents it was all an old story, even the picking of oranges. The grove was near a beautiful stream, not such a river as was the Argonaut of Deepdale, but broader, more shallow and sluggish. "I wonder if there are alligators in it?" asked Betty of one of the pickers. "Not around here," he answered. "You have to go into the bayous or swamps for them critters. Don't you all worry about the gators." "We won't when we get in the Gem," said Betty. "I wonder when they will bring her up and launch her." "Let's go to the depot and find out," suggested Amy. "We can have a carriage and team with a driver any time we want it, Uncle Stonington said." At the freight office, the boat was promised to them for the following day, but it was 2 before this promise was kept. "You mustn't fret," said Mr. Stonington, when Betty grew rather impatient. "Remember, you are down south. Few persons hurry here." But finally the Gem arrived, and after some hard work she was launched. Proudly she rode the river, as proudly as at Deepdale, and Betty, with a little cry of joy, took her place at the wheel. Batteries and magneto were in place, some gasoline was provided, and a little later the motor boat was ready for her first trip in southern waters. "All aboard!" cried Betty as the engine was started. Slowly, but with gathering speed, the trim craft shot out into the middle of the Mayfair. "Oh, this is just perfect!" breathed Molly. There was a little cloud on the face of Grace. They all knew what it was, and sympathized with her. No news had come about Will. They puffed along, to the wonder and admiration of many of the colored pickers, who stopped to look. Any excuse was good enough for stopping, especially the sight of a motor-boat. Suddenly Grace, who was trailing her hand over the stern, gave a startled cry and sprang up. "Oh, oh!" she screamed. "An alligator! I nearly touched the horrid thing. Go ashore, Betty." End of chapter.